A small bomb exploded at an airport in the Canary Islands. Hours later, 583 people were dead. But not from the bomb. They died somewhere else, on a fog-covered runway in a small airport in Tenerife, an airport that was never designed to handle the pressure suddenly placed on it. Almost everyone involved believed they understood what was happening. But, piece by piece, clarity was already disappearing. The deadliest disaster in aviation history is often described as a collision between two airplanes. That's true. But it's also incomplete. Because by the time those airplanes collided, the disaster had already been unfolding for hours. And in some ways, for years. March 27th, 1977. The Canary Islands. A chain of volcanic islands off the northwest coast of Africa, controlled by Spain and heavily dependent on tourism. Thousands of travelers moved through the islands every day. Vacation flights, tour groups, families, routine traffic moving through a routine system. And on that Sunday afternoon, much of that traffic was flowing through Gran Canaria Airport. Then a bomb exploded inside the terminal. The bomb had been planted by a separatist militant group seeking independence for the Canary Islands. The explosion killed no one directly, but it injured several people, and it triggered something far larger than anyone could see at the time. The airport temporarily shut down. Aircraft already inbound suddenly had nowhere to go. And so, one by one, they began diverting to another airport nearby, Los Rodeos Airport. That decision made perfect sense. At first. Los Rodeos was a much smaller airport, and airports are not open parking lots. Large aircraft cannot simply be placed wherever there's room. Airports function through choreography, spacing, sequencing, visibility, predictable movement. And suddenly, the choreography was changing faster than the airport was designed to absorb. More and more diverted aircraft arrived. Parking areas filled to overflowing. Aircraft were parked in unusual locations. Taxiways became partially blocked. And the airport began operating well outside its normal, calm, relaxed, and routine pattern. That's important. Because systems often appear stable right up until the moment they exceed the assumptions quietly holding them together. None of this deviation from the norm at Los Rodeos meant catastrophe was inevitable. And yet, flexibility was disappearing. And flexibility is often what prevents small problems from becoming deadly ones. Meanwhile, inside the aircraft, pressure was building too. Passengers had already endured delays and uncertainty. Crews were watching schedules slip. Fuel calculations mattered. Duty hour limits mattered. And sitting among the growing congestion at Los Rodeos was a KLM Boeing 747, commanded by one of the airline's most experienced training captains. And that detail matters too, because Tenerife was not a story about reckless amateurs. The people involved were trained professionals operating inside a system that was becoming increasingly difficult to clearly understand. Then, the fog began rolling in, and with its arrival, the situation changed again. Los Rodeos was already known for difficult visibility conditions, but now the airport was crowded, improvising by necessity, and visibility was being measured in feet instead of miles. Controllers could no longer rely on clear visual confirmation of where an aircraft was, or where it was going. Pilots unfamiliar with the airport struggled to maintain spatial awareness. Aircraft that normally would have been easy to track became harder to identify with certainty. And certainty matters, especially in aviation. Because in clear conditions, airports operate on confirmation. In the fog, they begin operating on belief. And piece by piece, the shared mental picture holding the system together began breaking apart. By late afternoon, operations at Los Rodeos were no longer routine. Aircraft sat where aircraft normally didn't sit. Taxi routes had changed. Visibility continued worsening, and everyone involved was trying to solve a growing problem: how to get all of these airplanes moving again. Eventually, Gran Canaria Airport reopened. Now the diverted traffic could finally leave Tenerife, at least in theory. But congestion at Los Rodeos had created another complication. Some of the taxiways normally used to move aircraft were occupied by parked airplanes, which meant departing aircraft now had fewer options for movement across the airport. And in the fog, even simple movements become harder. Sometimes we imagine airports as giant open spaces with unlimited flexibility. They are not. Airports are carefully organized systems built around visibility, sequencing, spacing, and predictability. And when too many variables change at once, clarity begins degrading faster than people realize. KLM had taken on fuel while waiting. A reasonable decision under the circumstances, but refueling took time. Added delay. Waiting, more pressure to get moving again. Inside the KLM cockpit, a different kind of pressure existed. The captain was highly experienced and respected, trusted, and one of the airline's senior training pilots. And that experience mattered. But so did the culture surrounding it. In the 1970s, cockpit hierarchy operated differently than it does today. Captains held enormous authority. Junior crew members were less likely to directly challenge decisions. Concerns were often phrased softly, indirectly, not because the crews lacked intelligence or courage, but because human beings naturally adapt themselves to hierarchy, especially under pressure. And pressure was everywhere now. Delays, uncertainty, worsening weather, growing urgency to depart. The entire system was narrowing. Then came one of the most dangerous forces in complex systems: momentum. And once those assumptions began shaping decisions, reversing direction becomes harder than continuing forward, even when uncertainty remains. Especially when uncertainty remains. As the fog drifted across the airport, radio traffic became increasingly important. At Los Rodeos, there was no ground radar system capable of showing controllers exactly where aircraft were moving on the airport surface. Today, many major airports use systems that can track aircraft positions even in poor visibility. In 1977, much of that awareness still depended on visual confirmation, pilot reports, timing, memory, shared understanding. But shared understanding only works when everyone sees the same things. And by now, no one was seeing anything beyond the barrier of the fog. The Pan Am aircraft was still taxiing along the active runway, searching through the fog for the correct taxiway to exit on. Meanwhile, the KLM aircraft had positioned itself at the far end of the same runway and prepared for departure. And this is where Tenerife becomes so unsettling. There was no single moment where the situation obviously transformed into catastrophe. Instead, ambiguity accumulated. One incomplete assumption layered over another inside the tower cab, and inside the cockpits. Every line of sight was murky and clouded. More and more, controllers depended on radio reports instead of direct visual confirmation. And under worsening visibility, constant radio communication was becoming harder to interpret cleanly. Terms and phrases that pilots today would immediately recognize as dangerously ambiguous were still common at the time. The words sounded clear enough, but they allowed people to form slightly different conclusions. And in high-risk systems, slightly different can be fatal. At one point, the KLM crew transmitted a phrase indicating they were ready and beginning departure procedures. The tower responded with instructions related to the flight route after takeoff. But crucially, the controller had not actually issued explicit takeoff clearance. At nearly the same moment, another transmission came across the frequency from Pan Am, and the two signals partially overlapped. To modern ears, it sounds almost impossible. How could two critical transmissions interfere with each other? But simultaneous radio transmissions often partially cancel or distort one another. Instead of clarity, people hear fragments. Enough to continue, not enough to fully confirm. And that may be one of the most haunting aspects of Tenerife. The system did not completely fail. It degraded just enough for dangerous assumptions to survive. Inside the KLM 747 cockpit, uncertainty briefly surfaced. A flight engineer asked a critical question. Is he not clear then? Meaning, was the Pan Am 747 aircraft fully clear of the runway yet? That question mattered enormously. But the answer was no, they were not. But by now, momentum had taken hold, and the KLM aircraft had already begun moving down the runway. And once motion begins under pressure, human beings become surprisingly resistant to interruption. Not because they're foolish, but because stopping means reevaluating, admitting uncertainty, rebuilding the mental picture from scratch. Continuing forward often feels psychologically easier, even when it becomes dangerous. Once committed to a course of action, reversing direction becomes harder than continuing forward, even when uncertainty remains. Especially when uncertainty remains. Meanwhile, inside the Pan Am cockpit, the crew was struggling to identify the correct taxiway exit through the fog. The airport layout was unfamiliar. Visibility was still collapsing, and the exits were harder to recognize than expected. They were still on the runway. Neither crew fully understood the other's exact position, and the controller could not directly see either aircraft clearly enough to resolve the ambiguity visually. A crowded airport, multiple loaded aircraft, hundreds of people. And the operation holding all of it together now depended largely on voices in the fog, trying to maintain the same awareness of where everyone was. But those understandings had begun to drift apart. Then, through the fog, the Pan Am crew saw the landing lights approaching directly toward them. At first, they could barely make out the shape. The realization hit. Another aircraft was accelerating down the runway straight at them. Another enormous 747. The Pan Am crew attempted a desperate turn off the runway. The KLM captain tried to rotate early, lifting the nose in a final attempt to clear Pan Am. But there was no longer enough distance, or enough time. The KLM aircraft slammed into the Pan Am jet at high speed. Fuel ignited instantly. Explosion and fire went through both aircraft. Within moments, 583 people were dead. The deadliest disaster in aviation history. But the disaster at Tenerife was more than a collision between two airplanes. It was what happened when the entire operation slowly lost synchronization with itself. In the years after Tenerife, aviation changed dramatically. And not because people suddenly became smarter, but because the disaster exposed weaknesses that had existed within normal operations for years. Cockpit culture changed. Modern aviation crews now train extensively in crew resource management. CRM encourages direct communication, collaborative decision-making, active challenge from junior crew members, questioning uncertainty before the momentum takes over. That philosophy did not emerge from theory alone. It was wisdom written in blood. Radio phraseology changed too. Modern pilots and controllers now use far more standardized language during critical operations. Ambiguous wording was reduced. Explicit confirmation became far more important because Tenerife demonstrated something simple but deeply dangerous. People can hear the same words and come away understanding completely different things. Technology changed as well. Many airports now use surface movement radar and runway incursion warning systems capable of tracking aircraft even in poor visibility. Controllers today often have tools that the tower at Los Rodeos simply did not possess in 1977. But technology alone was never the full lesson. The deeper lesson was about how quickly human coordination can begin to break down once normal assumptions stop matching actual conditions. That lesson extends far beyond aviation. You see it in hospitals, emergency response, hazmat incidents, power grids, wildfire operations, financial systems, infrastructure failures. Most disasters do not begin with a single catastrophic mistake. Usually the strain builds gradually. Small pressures accumulate. Normal patterns start to fracture. Visibility closes in. Tunnel vision kicks in. And people start relying more on what they think is happening than what they can actually confirm. And eventually, even competent people begin operating from different versions of the same moments. And eventually, even competent people begin operating from different versions of the same moments. Perhaps the most uncomfortable part of Tenerife is this. Almost nobody involved believed they were behaving recklessly. The crews were professionals. The controllers were professionals. And within the moment they were operating in, most of the decisions made sense. But the environment around them had changed faster than their awareness of those changes did. And by the time everyone realized they were no longer operating from the same reality, there was no margin left. So here's an ounce. Most catastrophic failures are not created by one dramatic mistake. They happen when small breakdowns accumulate quickly, until nobody fully realizes how the picture has already changed. And that's it. An ounce submitted for your consideration.